tell you things about your society that you may or may not know. I want to say first that the language we speak was designed hundreds of years ago, and it's almost impossible to talk to one another. Although we think we talk to one another, we really repeat a language that's highly insufficient. Whatever you say to other people, it goes in their heads and comes out to fit their society. You don't always communicate with people. So the problem is, can we develop a language that has consistent meaning? Well, if you still don't understand me, sometimes I might say, have a nice weekend. Why don't we say, have a nice life? Why just a weekend? Our language, again, is old. Is it possible to devise a language that's not subject to interpretation? When you read the Bible, if you do, it says Jesus meant this. Somebody says that. Oh no, he meant that. The third person says, you're both wrong. This is what he really meant. So you have the Lutheran, the Seventh-day Adventist, the Catholic, because it's subject to interpretation. The language of chemistry, mathematics, science, engineering is not subject to interpretation. When a chemist writes a formula, no matter what country it goes to, they interpret it the same way. I'm trying to tell you it's possible to develop a language that's not subject to interpretation. So we really talk at each other rather than to one another. That's a major problem. That's why lawyers exist. They can take language, mold it, reshape it, but you can't do that. Those of you that want to know how to communicate, there are books such as Science and Sanity by Alfred Korzybski, Language and Thought and Action by Hayakawa, The Tyranny of Words by Stuart Chase. You don't even know this, but the words you use have no communication value.
Hello everyone, welcome to the TZM Global Radio Show. I'm your host, Bakari Pace. I'm here with Martin Levinson, the president of the Institute for General Semantics here in New York City. I'm in the Albert Ellis Institute with him. Welcome to the show.
Well, very nice to be on the show.
Look
forward to the interview.
Awesome. For those who are unfamiliar with general semantics, are familiar with general semantics or familiar with the Zeitgeist Movement, you know that Jacque Fresco was a member of the Institute, and if not a member, was very influenced by the thoughts of and the feelings and the information of Alfred Korzybski, the author of Manhood of Humanity, and the book Science and Sanity. A lot of the people in the 1930s, early 1930s, who had been introduced to this information are some of the people who helped influence some of the thinking of Jacque Fresco. You can see that they're also referenced in a lot of his book materials. So, for instance, the author of Language and Thought and Action, the author of Tyranny of Words, which is Stuart Chase. A lot of these people were people who not only interacted with information about sustainable world, sustainable development, those types of information, but also people who had been impacted by the thoughts of Alfred Korzybski. In fact, Stuart Chase said that his mind was blown when he read Science and Sanity, to the point that he wrote the book Tyranny of Words, because he wanted his influence on the academic community to allow for Korzybski's work to be more disseminated in the culture. So I figured it'd probably be a good idea for people to get a hands-on reintroduction to some of the people who are still bringing this information forward, such as Martin here. So I wanted to talk with you about what the history of general semantics was, and sort of putting it in a cultural context from its inception, and also bringing it up to today.
Fine, that's great. Well, general semantics is the brainchild of Alfred Korzybski, who published the seminal work Science and Sanity in 1933, which explains the formulations of general semantics. Before that, he published a book called Manhood of Humanity in 1920, or 21, which really talks about the idea that it's a brotherhood of man, and we can go forward in a more productive way if we applied the methods of science to human relations. He had been a soldier in World War I and saw the carnage of World War I, and he thought, gee, the technology is so good for killing people. And technology in general is so good. And he said, we used to live in caves, human beings did, and now we live in skyscrapers. We used to travel around by walking around and crawling around, and now we can drive around and take trains. This was back in the 20s. And he said, if we could take technology and apply that to human relations, maybe people could learn to cooperate and be less conflicted and less misunderstanding. And so he put these ideas into his book, Science and Sanity, an 800-page tome, which is quite difficult to read. But and it was popularized later on by Stuart Chase in The Tyranny of Words, and S.I. Hayakawa in Language of Thought and Action, and Wendell Johnson in People in Quandaries, which are more accessible and are very interesting. And today we have General Semantics. We have a couple of groups, the Institute of General Semantics, the New York Society, and we're trying to get people more involved in general semantics and more interested in the formulations.
Can you talk to me a little bit about what Manhood of Humanity was as a book? Like what were some of the major topics that were talked about in that book? Because it seems it's the forerunner for Science and Sanity, if I'm not mistaken. It
is. Right after World War I, Korzybski said, instead of people fighting each other, it would be good if people would get together and cooperate. And he felt if we could apply our energies more in a cooperative way rather than a competitive way, it would be a better world. So it was an idealistic book, but it didn't come out with any specific strategies on how to do that. It was basically, the idea is, at this time, in the 20s was sort of a good time for many people, in that there was a lot of money around and a lot of science seemed to be burgeoning in the 20s and 30s. And so people were somewhat optimistic that the world could be improved. And so we said, let's see if we can find a system that would help in doing that. And so Manhood was sort of an inspiration to people to get together and be a brotherhood of all human beings, no matter what your ethnic group or racial group or national group. But let's get together as a international human species and see if we can move the species forward.
And this was being talked about in the 1920s, no less. A lot of people feel like the idea that this cosmopolitan perspective, this universalized personality is something that's brand new. But this is something that's been talked about for decades. In fact, now we're almost reaching the centennial of this type of, at least the publication of his book.
Well, we are actually. The Institute of General Semantics was founded in 1938. So in 2013, we're celebrating its 75th anniversary. Hopefully we'll be around another 75 years, we'll see. But one of his ideas was time binding, the idea that human beings are different than animals because we can pass information symbolically from generation to generation. Beavers still build beaver dams the same damn way that they've been doing it for thousands of years. But people, as I say, have gone from living in caves to living in skyscrapers because each generation passes on new ideas about architecture, and we pass around new ideas about lots of things, and we can do that because of the symbolic use of language. We have language, we have numbers, and so each generation benefits from the generation before. Animals really can't do that. It's instinctual, and the beavers still operate the same way they did 1,000 years ago. So that really separates, according to Korzybski, human beings from animals.
Let's talk a little bit about what general semantics is. Most people are confused by those terms because they seem to be already labeled in the culture. So we know what semantics is, and we know generally what general means.
Right.
But what do those words mean together so that people understand what the context and the necessity for general semantics is today?
Fine. Okay. Well, the way Korzybski came up, and first of all, I have to say that Korzybski was a Polish nobleman, and English was his fourth or fifth language. So when he chose general semantics, which many of us feel it's an unfortunate term because people confuse it with semantics. So when they say, well, I know general semantics, it's semantics. I studied semantics. But in fact, semantics is about word meanings, and it's a small part of general semantics, which is about not the meaning of words, but the meaning of people who use words. So one of the things we say in general semantics is don't look to the dictionary for meaning, look to the people who use the words and see how they're using the words, and what they mean by the words. That's how you get understanding, not by going to the dictionary and saying, oh, this is what you mean. That's not a very good way to have a conversation. But in any event, semantics, the way Korzybski wanted to use it, comes from the Greek term semenin, which means meaning or significance. So it's general meaning, the idea of studying meanings behind things. So that's why he chose the term, which, as I say, many of us feel it's unfortunate because it gets confused with the term semantics.
Mm-hmm. So what was the actual, I guess, practice of general semantics? Like, how did he see it practically applied so that people sort of get a tangible feel of what general semantics is?
Well, he wanted it to be practically applied. I mean, it's a theory, but it's in a system. But he actually said the only way it's any good is if it's applied. The idea, he didn't think it was that great that you learned it and you could then pass a test about knowing general semantics. He said, no, what you really needed to do is apply it. And there is specific formulations. I'll give you just a couple. The formulation etc., which is actually the title of the General Semantics Journal we put out, etc., a review of general semantics. He said, we think we see things in the world and that's what they are and that's all they are. So you say, oh, I know all about this, or this is what this is, or this is what that is. But in fact, there's always more to be said about anything. Mm-hmm. And so he said, whenever you say something, I know this or I know that, in your mind put in a silent, etc. There's always more I can say, there's always more to learn. Mm-hmm. And that keeps you open to things and open to ideas. He also said, be careful when you use that little two-letter word is, because it can confuse you and confuse others and lead to arguments. For example, if you say something like, that's a good movie, or that is a good movie, it sounds like you're saying, well, that is like a table, or that is a table, that is a desk. In fact, that is a good movie is a very subjective statement, and what you really mean is, that is a good movie to me, or I think that is a good movie. And it would be better if you said, I think that is a good movie, or that is a good movie to me, because it would help prevent arguments. Mm-hmm. Because if you say that is a good movie, then of course if someone says, I don't think that's a good movie, well, how could you think that if that is a good movie? Mm-hmm. So one of the things Korzybski said is, whatever you say something is, it isn't. It's more, it's different. And so that can keep you more involved in a specific instance and keep you in the moment.
One of the things that's said about, or I believe Korzybski said that to put a frame of what general semantics was, is that it was non-Aristotelian logic.
Yes.
Can you explain what that means? What's the difference between what is Aristotelian logic and from his perspective, and how does general semantics define itself outside of that?
Well, Aristotle did a lot of great things, and one of the things that he gave to mankind, or humankind, was this Aristotelian logic, which are formal rules of logic. For example, a thing is either A or not A. So what general semantics says, well, a thing can be either A or not A, or both A, or not either. So it's a way to open up your thinking to not have either or categories. It's either good or bad. Well, we think that way. You're either thin or fat. Heavy, well, okay, that's the same thing. But basically, instead of thinking either or, which narrows down the way you think about things, one might think on a continuum. I mean, there are degrees of goodness. There are degrees of badness. There are degrees of weight. There are degrees of weather. It's not like it's either cold or hot. It's 38 degrees, it's 42 degrees, it's 57 degrees. And also in general semantics, we don't say it is cold or hot, because the coldness or heat that you're feeling is an interaction between you and the environment. So when someone says, it is hot in the room, what they really mean is, I feel hot in this room. Mm-hmm. The room is just, there's a certain temperature you can find on a device, but that's what's going on in the room. The heat you're feeling is what's going on between you and the way you're interacting with the environment.
It's fascinating. So what are some of the principles that general semantics applies? What are some of the in-depths of it? How do we expand this conversation so we know more about what general semantics is, and then how do we do the practice of it?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, general semantics has been applied to many different fields. I've written extensively about it. I had one chapter in a book where I show where it's applied to 40 different fields. I was in education. I applied it to reducing alienation in school, students in school. It's employed in communication courses where people use general semantics to communicate more effectively. It's been used in negotiation. There was a fellow by the name of Jerry Nirenberg who established the Negotiation Institute, and he's written about negotiation where it's not win or lose. He claims he coined this concept. I think he might have win-win, where everybody wins in a negotiation. And he used some of the formulations of general semantics to come up with that. It's been used in engineering. It's been used in law. We have a federal mediator on our board who used it in his federal mediation efforts. It's used in psychology. Albert Ellis, the famed psychologist, whose Psychology magazine, I think, ranked in the late 1990s as the second most popular psychologist in the world after Carl Rogers, used many of the principles of general semantics in his psychology in dealing with people. So there's a whole group of fields that have used the formulations of general semantics to improve what goes on in the field, and that is it helps people to evaluate their situations and their way in the world more effectively and more accurately.
So what are some of those things? What are those principles? What are the functions that general semantics talks about?
Well, I'll give you a few simple ones. General semantics talks about dating, and that's not going out on a date with a man or woman. It's about the fact that we change, and one of the ways to acknowledge that we change is to put a date, an actual number on where you are. For example, whoever you are in 2013, you were not that same person in 1993 or 2003 or even a week ago. So if you say, well, I know all about John, I've known him all my life. Well, in fact, you don't know all about John, and John is different weekly, monthly, views change, physical appearances change. In 7 years, all the cells in our body change. So in fact, the only thing permanent in life is change. Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, said basically you can't step in the same river twice. The river, like life, is always moving. And although language, we like to label things, the things we label really aren't static. They're processes. So if you say this is a cup, actually to be scientifically more accurate, you should say this is cupping, because the cup is a group of thousands, and actually more than that, but millions and millions of electrons and subatomic particles that are whirring around at speeds too fast for us to see. So we label what we can see because our perception isn't that good, cup. But actually what's going on is cupping. It's processes of solid objects whizzing around so quickly we can't see them unless we had special apparatus like an electron microscope. So that would be one example, using dating. There's also something called indexing, where instead of taking categories like it's good in prejudice education, where you say Jew, a Muslim, a Christian. I don't like Jews, people say. I don't like Muslims. I don't like Christians. Well, that's interesting. What if you looked at the people individually? Joe is a Christian. Mary's a Christian. Pam is a Christian. So Christian 1, Christian 2, Christian 3. You may like that particular person. You may dislike another person. You may like a particular Christian, dislike another person who's labeled a Christian. So in fact, when you throw all people into one category, it's not accurate. And to see it's not accurate, separate the category into the specific parts through indexing. Person 1, person 2, person 3, person 4, etc. So that's another way that general semantics is useful, to see things more clearly, not to lump things in an abstract category, but to look at things specifically.
Have we talked about the structural differential? I thought that was a very fascinating way, the different tiers and levels in which you perceive things.
It is. Actually, the structural differential was a device that Korzybski came up with when he gave a talk, I believe it was at the New School in the 1930s. And they say,
the New School was actually founded by Thorstein Veblen, one of the people who is in our book list as well.
Oh, okay.
And he was also one of the brainchilds for a lot of the information that we speak about today in the book, Engineers on the Price System, and you mentioned it earlier today, Theory of the Leisure Class.
Oh, Theory of the Leisure Class, yeah.
He was the president. He founded the New School around the 1930s, actually.
Oh, I didn't know we found it. That's interesting. I remember reading Thorsten Veblen years ago, but I remember Theory of the Leisure Class. But the New School was always a sort of a hotbed for liberal thinking. And they invited Korzybski to do a lecture on general semantics, and he felt he wanted to come in with a device to show what it is quickly. This was before the computer age, so we had to construct something that he could show to the students. So we constructed something called a structural differential, which he felt explained in a illustrative term reality. And actually, your listeners out there can Google structural differential and find the diagram and perhaps a more detailed explanation than what I'm going to give. But in any event, it starts out with a parabola on top, and the parabola has lots of little holes and dots, and that's supposed to represent the electron, or the atomic, the subatomic level, where all these electrons and protons are whizzing around. We can't see them with the naked eye. You could, see them with specialized instruments, electron microscopes, but they're out there. But that's the first level. Then there's the next level he labeled the object level. And on that level, it's what we perceive with our perceptual apparatus, our ears, our eyes, smell, and it's what we take in. And we take in so much that we really couldn't describe it all. But we feel it, we sense it. And he's saying, well, that's fine, but on the object level, which is the next level that's going on, you really can't specifically describe it, even if you think you are. So that means you're 2 levels away from reality, according to this particular diagram, whenever you say something. And the third level would be the object, would be the descriptive level, where you're actually giving what you think are facts. You say, well, this is a desk, this is a chair, this is a book. And those are statements where we all can generally agree upon. They're sort of factual statements. We agree with the general definitions. You can look them up in a dictionary. We all would kind of agree on that. Although there'd be disagreements on perhaps what is a chair, for example, can be used as a table if you want to sit there and put a piece of paper and write on it. So you can have disagreements over factual statements, but they're closer to what people would agree on. Then there'd be inferences. For example, this is a chair, this is a nice chair. Well, that's a statement that perhaps could give lots of argumentation, because what you consider nice and what I consider nice are different things. And then this is the best chair. This is the greatest chair. Well, that's still another level away from the descriptive statement, because there's a lot of disagreement there, and you're leaving out specific characteristics. Well, what color is the chair? How does the chair feel to different people? How high is the chair? So the more you go onto abstractions, the fewer details you put in. And then there's something called the circularity of knowledge, where when you finally get to super high level abstractions, you're really getting back to something that's as complex as the electron level, the subatomic level. So this is sort of an overall quickie description of the structural differential, but I think if people are really interested in learning more about it, they should Google it and see what's the I think Wikipedia has actually a fairly good description of the structural differential, or read about it in some of our books.
So that's a good lead-in. Let's talk about how people can get an opportunity to learn more about general semantics. For me, I've been traveling down this road to actually end up meeting you, because I wanted to figure out more about what were some of the underlying concepts or reasons why Fresco came to some of his conclusions, and that brought me initially to the Institute of General Semantics. That's how I was introduced to you. Then to Gad Horowitz, who does a class on radical general semantics. I wanted to get some of your information about different places where people can learn more about general semantics.
Well, they can go to the Institute of General Semantics website. And if they go there, we have pull-down menus, and you can pull down. We have a bookstore where you can order books from us. We have free online materials. There's a continuing education guide that you can download free. There are some other teaching materials you can download free. There are some very good introductory books. Some of them that I would recommend is Drive Yourself Sane by Susan and Bruce Kodish.
Before you go past, let's talk about some of these books. The books tend to to span some of the different concepts very well.
Right.
Let's talk about first the original, the early books, not the original, the early books. So you
Okay.
have Science of Sanity.
Right.
You have Tyranny of Words. What are your thoughts about the Tyranny of Words on Science of Sanity, and whether or not people should jump into those books?
Well, I wouldn't jump into Science and Sanity. That's an 800-page. Actually, there's a nickname for Science and Sanity. It has a blue cover, so some people label it the Blue Peril, because it's a dense book and it's really packed with the science, the latest science of the early 1930s. So some of that science is out of date, but Korzybski was writing in the 1930s, and that's what he had. That's what was going on then. The ideas are good, and certainly if you really want a good mental workout, I would suggest reading that book. But there are, I think, more easily accessible ways to get into general semantics, and I would recommend other books for a person who's just beginning. Stuart Chase's book, The Tyranny of Words, is actually a very good start for people, but it was written in 37 or 38, and again, it's somewhat dated. Although the ideas are good, and Chase is a wonderful writer. I mean, he was writing that book, I think he says, for the intelligent layperson. So you really don't
Which
have...
is my audience.
Great. Which is, well, many of us are, including me, but you really don't have to be a PhD to really read this stuff. So Stuart Chase's book was a good one. Now, S.I. Hayakawa wrote a book that became a bestseller, a Book of the Month Club selection in 1941. It was originally labeled Language in Action and then relabeled Language and Thought in Action. And I think in 1990 they came out, the publisher came out with the 5th edition. That's a very interesting book about how the language causes us to think in a certain way, and we don't even realize how that happens. And lots of illustrations, lots of interesting general semantics ideas and formulations. So that's a book I would recommend, Language and Thought in Action.
My favorite concept that brought me into general semantic thinking was a concept, I'm sure you're probably familiar with this joke if you're not. The idea, it goes, a man, a father and a son were in a car and they get into a car accident. The father is killed instantly. The son is brought to the hospital, and the doctor walks into the hospital and walks into the emergency room to operate on the son, and walks out of the hospital room and says, I can't operate on this child because the child is my son.
Right. Actually, I've heard that one.
You've heard that one, yeah.
I have.
So
That's used in general semantics. We've used that already, yeah.
And most people are just totally confused by it. They don't know. If you're listening right now, I'm sure right now you're probably saying something like, it wasn't really his father, or it's a stepfather, or maybe they were gay or something like that, and you completely miss the fact that there are two parents in any relationship, and it's obviously his mother. Right. But it's so that idea just misses people because the language itself has hidden. And I never said he. I never said his. I never said any of those words when I was describing this doctor. But the language itself grabs certain. It's attached to certain concepts, certain ways that we think, and it pulls beliefs out of people.
Right. I mean, we all think automatically about certain things because that's the way we've been indoctrinated. So one of the ideas of general semantics, one of the formulations is delay your reaction. Korzybski always said, delay your reaction. Even a delay of less than a second causes you to think more deeply about things, and you don't have to respond so quickly. I know we live in a very fast-paced world where everyone's doing a lot of multitasking, but if you slow down just a little, you may be more effective, and you probably will see things and think about things more clearly. The race always doesn't go to the one who does it the fastest, but the one who does it the most accurate. And to be accurate, it pays often to slow down, think about what other people are saying, think about what you're saying, and it's a simple idea to delay your response. It's been helpful to me. Often, not often, but sometimes. Often when I was younger, less so as I get older. But someone will say something that really annoys me or bothers me, and I'd want to snap back right away with a clever remark or an insult. And when I've done that, it's usually backfired, because as clever as it is, I'm going to hurt the other person, get the other person angry, and it's not going to get us anywhere but into an argument. But if I delay my reaction, I'll also come up with a better response, and it'll be better for the relationship and better for the conversation.
There's a great story that Dale Carnegie gives in his book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, where he says that General Ulysses S. Grant, was it Grant? I believe it. No. It was a general before Grant, who they could have ended the war. That North had the South trapped between a riverbank and really their forces, and the general hesitated and said that he didn't want to react to, he didn't want to capture the South, and which could have ended the war. The war would have been completely ended right there. They were trapped. The forces would have been overpowering. And Lincoln was sending letters to this general saying, attack now, attack now,
right.
attack now.
Right.
And the general wrote back, he said, I'm not going to attack, I don't want to. So, and then the South escaped. So as the South escapes, the general, actually Lincoln writes a letter where he's just pouring out all the, and if anyone knows the history of Lincoln is a writer. He's a very good writer. He knows how to insult people to the point that somebody almost wanted to kill him for how crazy he was. But he wrote this vicious letter,
right,
and never sent it.
Right.
He put it inside of his enclosed box. Never sent the letter.
Yeah.
And some people have asked the idea that it's possible that Lincoln probably looked at this letter and said, "I could send this letter.
Yeah.
But I'm here in the comfortable White House. This guy's in the trenches right now. Who knows why he doesn't want?" But yeah, so it's very important for people to learn that skill of holding back and feeling that anger, but also recognizing that people are having their own experiences detached from yourself.
Right. Now that's a good story. Actually, it's interesting. I know that story. I read that book. I think it's an interesting book. Of course, who writes letters today?
Yeah.
but you're right. It is a good idea. And by the way, what Lincoln did is something I would recommend. When I was a counselor, I would recommend that to the students I was with. Write things down and don't act on them. But you're getting your feelings out. But you're not doing it so that it'll rebound in a bad way toward you.
Yeah.
And then, if you want to say it the next day, sleep on it. But, I think it's a good idea. Make sure no one finds that.
Yeah. What were some of the other books? So we talked about the first three books, Science and Sanity, Tyranny of Words, Linguists and Thought and Action. What are some, possibly some newer publications?
Well, okay. Well, I tell you, the book that got me very interested in general semantics was a book called People in Quandaries by Wendell Johnson. Sadly, it's out of print and it's somewhat dated. But it was a wonderful book by a counselor at the University of Iowa who applied general semantics in ways that really were very helpful to his students who were having difficulty. These were college-age students. And if any of your listeners out there are college-age people with difficulties, and they don't mind hearing examples that are 1940s examples, but the truths are there, I would say that's a good book to look at, People in Quandaries. You could probably get it on Amazon used. Some other books, as I think I mentioned before, Bruce Kodish and his wife Susan Kodish wrote a book called Drive Yourself Sane, which is
what does that mean? That the idea that Fresco says this often, that the world is not insane, the world is unsane. Unsane,
yeah. That's the term Korzybski used. Well, Korzybski, when he came up with his with general semantics during the 1920s. He said it seemed to him the most sane people were scientists when they were doing science. In other words, the language of science is a very sane language because what science is the scientific method. So what you're doing is you're making a hypothesis and you're seeing if it's true. You're not saying it's true automatically. You're saying this is what I think and I'm going to test it. And then you test it and you look at the results, and if it proves what you say, okay, well, it looks like it's okay. And if it doesn't prove it, you say, well, gee, we need to revise the hypothesis. So he thought that was very sane. And then he thought, well, who are the most unsane or not sane people? And he thought those were people in mental institutions. So he spent 2 years at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington studying mental patients. And he found those patients didn't use the scientific method. They just had these delusions and fantasies, and they accepted them as real without ever really thinking about testing them. So he came up with the idea that most of us aren't totally sane, like scientists who aren't the sanest people, but they are sane in terms of when they're doing science. and most of us aren't really so insane we're in mental institutions. We're somewhere in the middle, which is on a continuum of unsanity, where we're not as good as the scientists are when they're doing their experiments, and not as bad as the mental folks. So the question is, how can you get less insane by adopting the scientific method in your daily life? And he recommended that.
How do you? I'm assuming that Bruce goes into driving yourself sane. How does that process work? How do you incorporate scientific method into your behavior? Which is actually one of the things that the Zeitgeist Movement is very active with in the concept of getting people to be able to comprehend not only the scientific method, but also be able to use that in the way that we make decisions.
Okay, well, anytime you're having a problem, you say, well, gee, people say, well, I really can't do something. I can't write. I mean, I've written a few books, and I tell people, well, why don't you try to write something? Oh, I'm not a writer, I can't write. And I'll say, well, where's the evidence for that? Well, they'll say, well, I've never written anything. I'll say, well, okay, well, obviously you've written things for school, I'm guessing, papers. Well, yeah, but I really couldn't do a serious work. Well, where's the evidence for that? Well, I haven't done it. Well, have you tried to do it? Well, no, but I don't think I could do it. Well, how do you know? Have you tried to do it? Well, no. Well, why don't you try to do it? Do it scientifically. Give yourself a few hours each day for a week or two and see what happens. Well, that'd be a scientific way to say whether you could write or not. In other words, before you shut things out in your life, see if you could do it. I think what most people say what they mean when they say they can't write is they can't write as well as they'd like to think they would like to write, so they don't try. But even if you write badly, if you enjoy it, I say write. I forget who said it. I think it was Oscar Wilde. But anything worth doing is worth doing badly.
That's very fair. So we talked about driving yourself sane.
Yes.
What was that book about in terms of, like, of course, driving yourself sane, but what does that really imply?
Well, it implies, really what he's trying to get at is if you use the formulations of general semantics, you'll be a little less nutty. You'll be more effective, more effective with others, more efficient in how you operate. So it's a catchy title to get people interested, but basically it's General Semantics 101. It's a way to learn the formulations of general semantics. It's a good book. It has a glossary in the back. You'll learn the terminology. There's a good index. There's a bibliography. And I would recommend that as a good starter for people interested in general semantics. There's other material. Steve Stockdale wrote a book you mentioned that you had read it. It's on the internet. You can download it for free.
Completely for free. Just type in the name Steve Stockdale, General Semantics, and you'll find that book. I'm going to try to see if I can locate the name of it throughout the conversation.
Okay, fine. I've written a few books on general semantics. I've written one called Practical Fairy Tales for Everyday Living, which is sort of a light-hearted way to learn the formulations of general semantics. I've written a couple of other books, Sensible Thinking for Turbulent Times, where I've applied general semantics formulations to different areas of life. Last year I came out with another book, More Sensible Thinking, which I talk about general semantics and personal relationships and analyzing social trends. I recommend my own books, obviously. I think those are good. We have a journal, the Etc. Review of General Semantics, which talks about general semantics formulations. To get the journal, though, you have to join the Institute. I'll do a shameless plug. It's $50 a year, and for that you get the 4 journals and a discount to what we sell in the store. And there's a blog we have online. We have Facebook. We have all the latest social media, and a nice group of people.
Joining the Institute, you can find, because a significant amount of my audience are students. So there's student rates as well.
There is. Right? There's a student discount, $25 for students, and you get the same thing. You get the 4 journals a year, and the discounts. And we're always looking forward to having students join, because you're the next generation, as they say in Star Trek.
Yeah.
And you're the good time binders. It's the older folks handing down the information to the younger folks, who'll hand it down to the younger ones after that. So you're the time binding link that we would like to have in the organization. So please look at our website at the Institute of General Semantics. Google it.
The book by Steve Stockdale is called "Here's Something About General Semantics: A Primer for Making Sense of Your World," and you can find that book completely for free on the site. So there's a person I've been looking forward to talking about on the radio show, and that's Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller actually spoke at the Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture in the 50s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about Fuller, his influence, and sort of what you know about him, XYZ?
Yeah, sadly, I know little about Fuller, but I know a lot about the Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture.
Oh, we can go into that then.
Okay. What happened is Korzybski died suddenly in 1950. And what happened is the executive director of the Institute then decided to commemorate him by holding a lecture every year in his honor. It's called the Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture. I think it started in 1951 or 52, and we haven't missed a year. It's held at a fairly nice location each year. The last 3 years we've held it at the Princeton Club in New York City. Before that it was at various colleges. It's been held at the Harvard Club, the Yale Club, etc. And back in the 50s, Buckminster Fuller delivered one of our lectures. We've had other fairly famous folk back in the 50s. Ashley Montague, the anthropologist, delivered a lecture. Jerome Bruner delivered a lecture on education. Ben Bova, the editor of Nova, the science magazine, delivered a lecture. A few years ago we had the daughter of Margaret Mead deliver a lecture. So we've had some fairly prominent people deliver these lectures that have to do something with general semantics. Sadly, although I've seen Buckminster Fuller's name as being one of our earlier lecturers, I don't know what he lectured on or if we have the contents of that lecture, but I'm going to look.
Okay, that sounds good. As long as we can get some content of it, it's always awesome. But let's see, what was the role of Immanuel Kant in? And I'm a philosophy major, of course. Okay. So I want to bring up a little bit of philosophy. Good. What was the role of Immanuel Kant in either Korzybski as a critique of Immanuel Kant or incorporating Kant's?
I'm not exactly sure. I know Kant, I believe Kant was responsible for the phrase dare to inquire or dare to know, which was sort of the banner for the Enlightenment. And I think Korzybski would agree that, and by the way, Bruce Kodish wrote a book. I believe one of the books he's written is Dare to Inquire, which is, I guess, a paraphrase of Kant. So the idea is we really want to dare to know, learn about things. You know, don't assume you know about something. Don't feel scared that you can't learn something. But the Enlightenment thinkers said, you know, use reason. I mean, emotion is important and maybe is a driver of reason, but use reason. You think. Korzybski said, you know, one of the other things that separates from animals is the quarter-inch of cortex we have that they don't. That means, you know, we have very highly developed brains. Use those brains to think about things. And of course, use those brains to delay your reaction. You don't have to think about things so quickly.
So here we're about the 40-minute mark, so let's make some closing remarks and things. So is there anything else that you want people to be able to grab onto? Any ideas that you'd leave people with? Anything of that nature?
Well, I like to leave people with a couple of ideas. I say one of them is if you want to be a more effective evaluator, evaluating yourself, evaluating the world around you, you might want to look at our website. You might want to study a little bit of general semantics and see if that helps with that process. If it does, you'll learn some more. If it doesn't, you'll say it was an interesting experiment. That's one thing. Korzybski said something about is, which I think is interesting. He said, whatever you say something is, it isn't. There's always more to be said. There's always more to learn. There's always more to find out. And I would leave your audience with that particular idea because, particularly today, there's so much to know. No one can know even the littlest bit about things because there's just so much out there. But do your best to learn what you can and keep open to things. And good thinking.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levinson.
Thank you. That was great.